Welcome to the Deep Dive. We sort through stacks of research, news reports, and expert takes to bring you the core insights on complex topics. Today we're looking into something often unseen, but really deeply woven into many households across Asia: the lives of foreign domestic workers, FDWs for short. And what jumps out almost immediately is this tension, right? How do societies balance their need for essential care, childcare, elder care with the fundamental human rights of the workers providing that care? That's really the paradox we want to unpack.
Absolutely. We've found some, really eye-opening reports, sometimes quite heartbreaking situations involving FDWs, especially in places like Singapore, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. So a goal today is first to look at some individual stories, really get a feel for the immediate realities, then maybe explore the history a bit, like how did this reliance on FDWs even start in these places? And finally, we'll try to compare the regulations directly and maybe more importantly, the actual day-to-day conditions these workers face.
Okay, sounds like a really crucial deep dive. So let's jump right into some of those immediate and frankly sometimes quite shocking realities that highlight the complexities here. You
Yeah.
mentioned Taiwan. There was a recent case from
Oh,
Sinchu.
yeah, I saw that one. An Indonesian FDW, right? Hired for, I think, only about 5 months to care for a grandmother.
Exactly. And she literally gave birth
Mm-hmm.
in the employer's bed. I mean, just picture that scene. A birth happening completely unexpectedly right there in the employer's home.
It's astonishing. And what really stood out was the employer's reaction, complete shock. They said they had absolutely no idea she was pregnant.
How could they not know? I mean,
Well, apparently she consistently wore baggy clothes. And it came out later she'd actually used a friend's medical documents for her pre-employment check.
wow. So there was definitely some level of, well, deception involved, which points to maybe desperation.
It really does seem that way. And you just imagine the scene they described, the unsuspecting grandmother sitting there in her wheelchair, turning around in shock when she hears a newborn baby cry. It paints a pretty chaotic picture.
Definitely chaotic. So what happens next, legally speaking,
Yeah.
after this unexpected birth in Taiwan? What were the immediate consequences for the employer?
Well, here's where it gets really interesting and actually quite protective for the worker, legally anyway. In Taiwan, employers are actually forbidden from firing pregnant workers or new mothers. If they do, they face some pretty hefty penalties, up to NT $1.5 million. That's roughly, US $47,000, plus a 2-year ban on hiring any new workers.
Right.
So the employer was suddenly in a very, very tight spot, legally and financially.
That's quite strong protection then, on paper at least.
Yeah.
But you mentioned online reactions suggested, well, frustration from employers. What was fueling that?
It seems like a mix of things. Yeah, despite those protections, online chat was apparently full of employers feeling it was unfair, calling for policy changes. Some were suggesting that workers are, quote unquote, taking advantage of social benefits, things like health insurance for both the FDW and her baby, which, the employer often bears the cost for in these situations.
Ah, okay, the cost factor.
Yeah.
I see. That's a big part of it. How significant are those costs typically?
They can be pretty substantial, especially unexpected medical and delivery fees on top of the salary. And in this specific Shinshu case, the plan was apparently for the worker to stay employed, but the baby was going to be sent back to the father in Indonesia.
Complex arrangements. And this isn't just a one-off Taiwan thing, is it? You mentioned
Yeah.
Singapore having similar surprises.
Yes, absolutely. There was a case in Singapore, again, an FDW hired for only 5 months. She went to the hospital complaining of stomach pain and, unexpectedly gave birth to a full-term baby. The employer, again, totally unaware because of baggy clothes, ended up paying over SGD $2,000. That's about HKD $11,855 for the medical and delivery fees.
Wow. So similar unexpected births, similar financial burdens hitting employers. Okay, let's talk about Hong Kong now and Lily's story, which sounds quite harrowing.
Yes, Lily's story is quite tough. She was an Indonesian woman, a former helper in Hong Kong. She actually fled her fourth employer. She reported severe physical violence, emotional abuse, things like being hit with a clothes hanger. She said she just couldn't take the mistreatment anymore.
That's awful. So she ran away. What happened then, especially regarding pregnancy?
Well, after fleeing, she had to survive somehow, right? So she ended up working illegally in a restaurant, I think it was. And it was during that time she fell pregnant by a Hong Kong man. She was eventually reported for the illegal work and actually served 6 weeks in jail. But what's really striking is that even though she was working illegally, the Hong Kong Immigration Department didn't immediately deport her because she was pregnant. That seems different.
It absolutely is. That's a crucial distinction. And that's where charities like Pathfinders came into the picture. They were able to help Lily locate the father of her daughter, who was a Hong Kong resident. And through legal means, they actually secured her daughter's Hong Kong residency. Lily herself, though, holds a temporary identity document, basically a street paper, meaning she's always at risk of being sent away. Pathfinders told us that these runaway helpers, especially if they have children, often lack access to critical medical and welfare resources. It leads to extremely difficult living situations for both mother and child, just really vulnerable. These immediate stories are so powerful, really highlighting that tension we started with. So moving from these often heartbreaking realities, it feels important to understand the history, the policies that kind of shape these conditions.
Yeah.
Let's start with Singapore. How did their heavy reliance on FDWs begin?
Well, Singapore's story really takes shape back in the 1970s. At that time, they were facing a growing shortage of local domestic labor. Wages were rising, making it harder for families to find help locally.
So the government stepped in. Was it a deliberate move?
Oh, very strategically.
Yeah.
In 1978, they introduced the Foreign Maid Scheme. And this wasn't just about bringing workers from nearby Malaysia anymore. It really opened the door wide for FDWs from the Philippines, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, other places too.
And what were the main goals behind this scheme? Was it just about filling jobs?
It seemed to be sort of twofold. One major goal was definitely economic, freeing up Singaporean women to join the workforce, especially in those high-growth industries back then, like textiles, electronics, things that were key to development. And the second goal was social, providing affordable childcare options for families, which, again, allowed more women to work outside the home. It was quite deliberate economic and social planning.
That sounds like it would cause a pretty rapid change. How quickly did the numbers grow?
Incredibly quickly. I mean, they went from roughly 5,000 FDWs in 1978 to about 40,000 just 10 years later, around 1980.
30,000, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you saw the impact directly. The female workforce participation rate climbed significantly during that same period.
Okay, 40,000 by 88.
Hmm.
Given those numbers, how strict was Singapore's initial approach to regulating these workers? What about their rights early on?
The initial approach was, well, very strict. Critically, FDWs were specifically excluded from the Main Employment Act of 1968 and the Workmen's Compensation Act of 1975. That meant significantly fewer protections than other workers right from the start. And historically, even before this scheme, back in the 60s, attempts by domestic workers, AMAs, to unionize were resisted. The government, both colonial and later independent, seemed wary of communist unions and preferred to keep employment conditions, let's say, indeterminate to avoid organization. They explicitly stated they didn't want to bring domestic workers under the employment laws.
Right, keeping it unregulated.
Exactly. And then, crucially, in 1986, Singapore explicitly banned FDWs from getting pregnant or marrying Singaporean citizens.
Banned pregnancy. How on earth was that enforced?
Through mandatory 6-monthly pregnancy and STD tests. Plus, employers had to put down a $5,000 bond.
A $5,000 bond.
Yeah. And this bond could be forfeited if their FDW became pregnant or married a Singaporean or did non-domestic work, committed a crime, even just overstayed her visa. It's incredibly restrictive, tying that huge financial penalty directly to pregnancy.
Wow. But policies sometimes evolve, right?
Yeah.
Especially maybe with public awareness. Things change over time.
Yes, things did shift, partly due to public outcry over some really high-profile maid abuse cases in the 1990s that did lead to some new protections.
Like what specifically?
Well, mandatory accident insurance was introduced in 1997. Harsher penalties for abusive employers came in 1998. Later, around 2006, a standard contract template emerged. It recommended, though it wasn't legally required, 8 hours of rest per day. And later still, they did codify employer responsibilities for things like providing adequate food, medical care, acceptable accommodations, specifying things like needing a proper room, mattress, blanket, good ventilation, and importantly, not sharing with adult males or teenagers.
So some progress definitely, but starting from a very, very restrictive base.
Okay, let's unpack this for Hong Kong. What's their historical context regarding FDWs?
Right. Hong Kong also permitted importing foreign domestic helpers starting around the 1970s, again, to address a shortage of local, full-time, live-in help. It's been a long-standing policy there to ensure local workers get priority, so FDWs are technically imported only if suitable local workers aren't available. Hong Kong actually has a notably high proportion of FDWs in its workforce. It was about 9.3% of the total workforce back in 2016. And what's fascinating there, as we touched on with Lily's case indirectly, is how studies show employing FDWs seems to positively impact household fertility decisions, especially for highly educated, high-income women.
Really? How so?
Well, it's seen as relieving the childcare burden, allowing women to maintain careers. It supports what researchers call the marketization hypothesis of childcare, basically. Making childcare a purchasable service influences family planning. Interesting. Okay, so what does all this mean for Taiwan? We heard about their strict hiring criteria and the pregnancy issue. What's their specific historical angle?
Taiwan has a massive foreign labor force, over 700,000 people. Most of the foreign workers, primarily women, are in domestic work. Their system involves quite strict hiring criteria. It often uses a points-based system to see if an employer even qualifies to hire an FTW, usually based on specific needs like caring for elderly or disabled family members. And it's this combination, the strict system plus the intense fear of being sent home, that seems to be why many FDWs, if their pregnancy is discovered, choose to become undocumented. They basically disappear from the legal system to avoid repatriation, even though firing them is technically illegal, as we discussed.
Wow. Okay, so we've kind of established the history and the different starting points for these places. Now let's really try to bring it all together. Can we explicitly compare the current rules and maybe more importantly, the actual working conditions for FDWs across Singapore, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, especially around pregnancy and just basic labor rights?
Absolutely. Let's start with pregnancy and dismissal policies, since that came up so much in the stories. Singapore, as we touched on, remains the most stringent. The general policy still requires pregnant FDWs to leave the country. Pregnancy is basically seen as a breach of their work permit conditions.
Okay, very clear cut there. And Hong Kong. Lily's story suggested more leniency. Is that generally the case?
Yes, actually. Hong Kong's laws are much more supportive on this front. Employers cannot legally fire a pregnant FDW from the time pregnancy is confirmed by a doctor until her maternity leave ends, unless there's really severe misconduct involved. If they do fire her unlawfully, they face a fine of up to HK $100,000. FDWs are entitled to 14 weeks of paid maternity leave, paid at 80% of their normal wages, provided they've been employed for at least 40 weeks.
14 weeks paid leave.
Exactly. And what's interesting is employers can actually apply to the government to reclaim a portion of that maternity leave pay. This helps ease the financial burden on the employer and, might encourage compliance. It's a much more supportive framework for pregnant workers compared to Singapore.
Definitely sounds like it. But there's a catch regarding the child's status, right?
Yes, that's crucial. Even if a child is born in Hong Kong, they don't automatically get Hong Kong permanent residency unless one of their parents is already a Hong Kong permanent resident. So that complicates things long term.
Right, okay. And Taiwan. We know they penalize employers heavily for firing pregnant workers, but what's the sort of the catch or the broader reality there?
The catch is the long game, really. While the employer faces penalties and the FDW and her baby do get access to health insurance, the fundamental issue remains. The child doesn't get Taiwanese citizenship. So it's this lack of citizenship for the child, coupled with the FDW's ongoing fear of eventually being repatriated, that often pushes pregnant workers underground into that undocumented status, making them incredibly vulnerable.
Okay, so that covers pregnancy policies. What about the day-to-day working conditions and basic labor rights? How do they stack up?
Well, in Singapore, as we mentioned, FDWs are notably excluded from the Main Employment Act and the Work Injury Compensation Act. This means, legally, there are no enforceable limits on working hours, no rules for overtime pay, and no government-mandated minimum wage. There are minimum wages set by their home countries, like about $550 a month for Filipinas, but not by Singapore itself.
And you mentioned the invisibility factor earlier. Because the work happens inside private homes, it's inherently hidden, making abuse or poor conditions hard to detect. Despite some regulations on accommodation and food, you still hear about practices like agencies charging huge fees that take months of salary to pay off, or employers illegally holding passports, severely restricting workers' movements.
Right, and that $5,000 bond we talked about in Singapore, how does that play into the day-to-day reality?
Well, the bond is meant to ensure the employer repatriates the worker if needed, like if they break the rules or the contract ends. But some argue it has this unintended consequence. It might inadvertently encourage employers to excessively monitor or police their FDW's lives where they go, who they meet, just to avoid losing that bond. It can feel like another layer of control, even fear. And then there's the issue of days off. A 2011 survey found only 12% of FDWs in Singapore got a weekly rest day. That did improve to about 40% by 2015, but still.
Only 40% by 2015, wow.
Yeah. And the top reason employers gave for not allowing days off was often cited as wanting to avoid the maid falling into bad company, which again often seems linked back to that fear of losing the bond if the worker gets into trouble, gets pregnant, etc.
Are there many complaints filed, do we know?
Embassies in Singapore report getting a high volume of complaints from their nationals working as FDWs, sometimes daily or monthly. So it suggests these aren't just isolated incidents, but fairly widespread problems. And many FDWs also fear reporting abuse to the police. They worry they might be disbelieved or just sent back to their employer or even repatriated. Mediation is common for wage disputes, but often FDWs accept less than they're owed just so they can move on to a new employer quickly.
Right, a very difficult position. Now, in Hong Kong, the situation regarding basic rights seems a bit clearer on paper. They have a statutory minimum wage, currently HK $4,990 per month. Employers are legally required to provide suitable and private live-in accommodations, specifically not temporary beds in corridors or sharing rooms with adult males. They also have clear legal entitlements to rest days, statutory holidays, and paid annual leave. Employers must provide employee compensation insurance and free medical care, too.
So more defined rights there.
Yes, and while cases of illegal passport holding or abuse still definitely happen, the authorities in Hong Kong do apparently conduct some random welfare checks on FDWs, which is a notable difference.
Okay. And Taiwan. What makes FDWs particularly vulnerable there, even if they have some policies like hotlines?
A key issue in Taiwan seems to be that FDW's visas and work permits are usually tied directly to one specific employer.
Ah, so they can't easily change jobs.
Exactly. If things are bad, poor conditions, abuse, they can't just switch employers easily. This creates a huge power imbalance. Beyond that, workers often pay really significant sums in recruitment fees. The recruitment sector reportedly makes around US $484 million annually, just in legal service fees from the workers themselves. The report we looked at strongly recommended an employer-pays principle to shift this financial burden.
That fee structure sounds like a major point of vulnerability.
Absolutely. And we also saw reports of some local officials in Taiwan imposing arbitrary restrictions on migrant workers' movement during the pandemic, stigmatizing them as disease carriers. One survey suggested 60% of migrant workers were forbidden by employers or brokers from leaving their accommodation at all.
Wow.
It really points to potential systemic discrimination that goes beyond just individual employee relationships.
It really does seem like this core tension, doesn't it? Balancing society's genuine needs for childcare and elder care against the fundamental human rights and well-being of the FDWs. It's just this constant, complex theme everywhere we look here.
Yeah.
And this often boils down to the minimum wage debate.
It's a constant tension, absolutely. On one side, you have the argument that, well, these wages, even if they seem low by local standards in Singapore or Hong Kong, are still competitive compared to what workers might earn back in their home countries like the Philippines or Indonesia. And crucially, the argument goes, keeping wages relatively low makes domestic help affordable for middle-class families, not just the very wealthy.
Which, as we discussed earlier, then supports things like higher female workforce participation, maybe even local birth rates, the sort of societal benefit argument.
Exactly. That's the argument. It's necessary for the economy and for supporting local families. But the counter-argument is, of course, very strong. Critics say it's fundamentally exploitative. Some even compare aspects of it to, well, modern forms of slavery in the worst cases. They argue FDWs should be paid a living wage relative to the cost of living where they work, not just compared to their home country. They focus on the human rights aspect, the dignity of labor, and that huge power imbalance that's inherent in the system.
The complexities here are just immense, aren't they? Reflecting these really deep societal needs right alongside profound human rights challenges. It's crystal clear that while the role of foreign domestic workers is absolutely vital in these places, their actual experiences vary so dramatically depending on where they are and the specific policies governing their lives.
Indeed. And as we've seen throughout these examples, it really is a constant, ongoing negotiation, sometimes a struggle between economic realities, social needs, and the fundamental rights and basic well-being of these essential workers.
This has been a really crucial deep dive into the often hidden realities of foreign domestic workers. We hope this exploration gives you, our listeners, a more comprehensive understanding of the challenges, the nuances, and the human stories involved in this critical global labor dynamic.